Mr. Chair, I can't and won't just get into a pros and cons on this issue. There are both pros and cons. We're all for free speech, and we all understand, though, I think that there are some limits to it. Fire in a theater and speech may be where you incite people to throw people out of a political arena where there are limits, and you cause violence or you threaten people. And so there are limits, but then we have respect for free speech. My concern is, while this is important, and no question it's an important issue, that the real important issues facing this country at this time is the First Amendment is freedom of the press. And there are attacks on the press on a regular basis today, which I think this subcommittee needs to look into. It was Richard Nixon who first thought that the press was the enemy of the people in modern history. Before that, it was Stalin. That was modern, too. But it wasn't American. It was before the Russian-American melding took place. And what we've seen here is the beginnings of fascism in some ways. And part of what you see with fascism disdain for the press, controlling mass media. There are other signs that we see that are scary, but that's part of it. The freedom of the press is so important to being a check and balance on government and to government that is uncontrolled. That is overarching the issue that we face today concerning the First Amendment, is the freedom of the press, not necessarily this particular limited freedom of speech, which is oftentimes on campuses, and oftentimes invective that is hurled at sexual orientation minorities and or people of minority religions, whether Jews or Muslims, gays, transgendered, etc. And there are some reasons to limit that speech because sometimes it turns to violence, and that's another problem that we have, seeing that we have, as one of the signs of fascism as exhibited at the Holocaust Museum, is identification of enemies as a unifying cause. And some of this is what happens there, and we're seeing it today. I also must mention today is the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination in Memphis 49 years ago. It's also the 50th anniversary of his speech at Riverside Church, which is the most powerful speech I think that I know in my lifetime, reflecting on the three isms, militarism, materialism, and racism, that still are the enemies of this nation and mankind, which we haven't been able to deal with in an appropriate way. And that Dr. King wasn't allowed to speak in Memphis, wasn't allowed to march in Memphis, and that's part of speech, is the ability to protest and to march. And the city didn't want him to protest. They had to, Mr. Lucius Birch had to go to court to get the federal court to allow him to march. And that's why he came to Memphis for people's rights and workers' rights, which weren't being respected. Unfortunately, that's where he was assassinated. So freedom of speech is important. We have come a long way with it. I understand, Mr. King, you're having this hearing, and I will submit into the record my wonderful remarks that were prepared on this subject that are just outstanding, but weren't the remarks I wanted to deliver today, because I thought with this anniversary of the speech and the assassination, it was important to reflect on Dr. King, but so much more important to reflect on the press and the limits that we've got in this country right now, and the ability to attempt to paint the press as enemies and fake news and to discredit the truth. You can have freedom of the press, but when you've got powerful people in your country claiming that the press is not to be believed and is putting out fake news, that's a problem. And the First Amendment didn't envision it. Our founding fathers, who we talk about being reverently and how brilliant they were, even though they didn't understand slavery was wrong and didn't understand, or if they did, they didn't have the guts to put it in the Constitution. And they didn't understand the fact that women should have a right to vote and to full participation, and people without property should have that right. They didn't anticipate an executive who talked about fake news and who parroted remarks without any professional or expert consultation that sometimes came straight from Russian television. So I would ask the chairman to try to look into having a freedom of the press First Amendment hearing, because that's what faces this country right now and is most urgent. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman return.